In 2012, I was a sophomore in high school, and I was sitting in an uncomfortable folding chair at a social justice seminar in Washington, D.C., watching a presentation. And the speaker started to discuss the Love Canal incident, which is where an entire upstate New York neighborhood was poisoned with toxic industrial waste. And as I listened to the horrors of this incident, my mind began to think about all the possible sources of contamination in my life and the lives of those closest to me. And then I was looking around the room, wondering why no one else seemed to be as horrified as I was. Instead, they appeared pretty unfazed. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there, my leg bouncing up and down, and I'm ready to run out of the room and take action to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. Since that day, I've been following this sense of obligation. I reasoned that science, and specifically engineering, appeared to be the best way to create effective change, because once you have data, you're no longer just someone with an opinion. But during college, I started to see a disconnect between the science being done at universities and the public. There seemed to be this invisible wall separating science from the communities that were in greatest need of it. I got involved in undergraduate research early on in my career, and I started to wonder about how the results from our work were ever going to reach the public. There seemed to be this cycle of conducting experiments, then writing papers that are so complicated that researchers can barely understand them, to putting them behind a paywall so that they're inaccessible to the public, and then receiving funding to do the same thing again. I realized that if I was going to pursue a career in research related to the environment and public health, it needed to reach the world outside the ivory tower, and it had to reach the public. So I decided to apply to graduate school in the hopes of finding a research lab doing more applied work. So applying to graduate school came with its own set of challenges. I had a lot of trouble finding professors who actually engaged with communities. I looked through every faculty page for over 40 engineering programs, and at the end came up with only a handful of professors who actually work with communities. Then one January afternoon, I was sitting in my car shortly after I'd finished submitting my graduate school applications when I got a call from a professor at Virginia Tech. And I didn't know it at the time, but he would go on to become my graduate research advisor. I was startled at first and tossed the phone into the seat next to me, because who calls people anymore these days? I quickly called back, though, and was given a rundown of what my PhD work would look like if I went there. And he told me about this large grant he'd recently received from the Environmental Protection Agency, and how that would allow me to do the citizen science and community work that I had wanted to do for the next 4 to 5 years. He spoke for a while about his philosophy on community engagement and how this would be a chance to do meaningful work, or, in a sense, save the world. As a natural skeptic, this sounded a little too good to be true. But he seemed genuine and was pretty transparent with me, offering to show me the grant itself. At the same time, I had some sage wisdom running through my mind about finding an advisor that you clicked with, and here I had found someone who was about equally focused on moral values and probably also went to sleep at night thinking about environmental challenges. Not a common find. So I went with my gut and decided to take the job. After being accepted to Virginia Tech, other opportunities rolled in from Stanford and Carnegie Mellon, essentially what every engineering student is told to aspire to. And if I told anyone that I was leaning towards pursuing public-inspired science at Virginia Tech over having a big red S on my resume, they looked at me like I was crazy. At one graduate school open house, I was speaking to a postdoc about my interest in community engagement, and he just looked at me really unimpressed and said, "Oh, you're into that investigative science stuff." This negative feedback led me to begin doubting myself and wondering about whether or not engineers should engage in citizen science. Was I being impractical, naive, and idealistic? Did I have to do this work during my PhD, or could it wait until I finished? And how would this impact my ability to find a job because it isn't wholly accepted yet? I struggled with this decision for months. And what it came down to was it was more than just a first world problem about where to go to graduate school. It was about my personal philosophy, my values, and who I would become if I prioritized prestige and acceptance over what I believed to be my calling. Somehow, I managed to find a whole team of people at Virginia Tech who, like me, care about environmental problems and environmental injustice, and believe in the value of citizen science. When I arrived at Virginia Tech, I was a little bit worried that graduate school would make me super competitive, but for the wrong reasons. I could become this hotshot researcher cruising at 120 miles an hour, but if I wasn't careful, I could lose my moral compass along the way. What if I spent years climbing this ladder full of academic rewards, of papers and awards, only to find out that, in the words of Brené Brown, the ladder was propped up against the wrong building? Fortunately, opportunities to do investigative science and help people and reflect on my actions and values came quite early. It was the third day of graduate school, in fact. I had just barely moved into my new apartment and hardly unpacked when I found myself dropping my dog off at a local boarding facility and driving 12 long hours to Illinois with two peers who were basically strangers at that point to conduct intensive water sampling in the homes and churches of Cicero and Berwyn, two suburbs directly outside of Chicago.
Getting the last of them into my computer list.
Okay.
With over 90% of the homes and businesses getting their water from lead pipes, they have had a lead and water problem for decades. In our testing, we found that they were not in violation of federal law, but thousands are still drinking unacceptable amounts of lead in their water every day. On a lighter note, this type of fieldwork was definitely different from anything I had experienced before, and I found it a little comical that my peers referred to it that way. Generally, I had reserved the term fieldwork for work that actually involved being outdoors, considering the last time I was doing fieldwork, I was ankles deep in a stream collecting water samples in a bucket, but I made peace with the term. Overall, this trip was humbling. The demographic in Cicero is about 90% Hispanic, and the familiar rolling of tongues and sightings of Café Bustelo containers on countertops reminded me of my hometown of Miami. Reflecting on that trip made me realize the important role that I play as a Latina in engineering in this field that often works with environmental injustice communities that are comprised of underrepresented individuals.
Thank you.
Early on in my graduate school experience, I worked briefly with two tenacious community activists, Dee and Lori, in Portland, Oregon. They've been working to tackle the lead problem there. And what's bizarre about Portland is that they've been exempt from the lead and copper rule, despite the fact that they've exceeded the lead and action level at least 12 times in the last 27 years. And local authorities still abstain from taking real action.
My name is Dee White. I am sorry and sad to report that Portland's drinking water continues to have one of the highest levels of lead, in fact, in the top 6 for all urban water systems. Last month,
we've attempted to conduct corrosion and water quality tests in the lab, but haven't been able to do so successfully yet due to problems acquiring water samples. The situation remains unresolved at present, and I feel a little guilty about not being able to do more. As a graduate student, you quickly realize that you cannot possibly do everything that you want to do. So after Portland came the mystery of chloride plaguing the residents of Orleans, New York. Their water has extraordinarily high levels of chloride, presumably due to road salt contamination, and this has been leading to accelerated corrosion of their plumbing and appliances, as well as leading to lead release in some cases. To get to the bottom of this puzzle and see if we can pinpoint road salt as the source of chloride in this case, I am comparing water quality samples from residents' homes to the chemical fingerprint of road salt.
Our results have shown that road salt is the contaminant, leading us to our next question: where is this road salt contamination coming from? It's a question that's growing more urgent as a $13.2 million water line is being installed in Orleans. We suspect that a Department of Transportation-owned salt barn is the source, after reviewing an investigation by consultants at Alpha Geoscience. However, the Department of Transportation has claimed that their own geological assessment found groundwater flowing from the salt barn away from the residents, clearing them of any liability for the water contamination. But when we filed a public records request for this geological assessment, it took about 1.5 years for the request to be completed, and the Department of Transportation was unable to find records of this assessment, even though it's the basis of their claim. If the state does not claim responsibility for the contamination, We're afraid that residents may be on the hook for around $900 annually for the next 30 years to pay for the new water line. I can't help but hear this and feel the same way I did when I learned about the Love Canal incident. Here, once again, we have a contamination that the state has not yet taken responsibility for, leaving residents on the hook for the cost to fix it. On top of that, our research uncovered a letter that claims this has been going on for decades. According to letters we found written by the late Kendrick Howard, who grew up in Orleans, his family began a motel and restaurant in the 1950s. By the mid-70s, his family had uncovered salt in the well that was supposed to provide clean water for guests. The family tried to get acknowledgement or settlement from the state for the contamination until Kendrick's father died in October of 1981. Afterwards, Kendrick claimed the state lawyers came to his mother to make a settlement and buy out the business, the value of which was low because of the contamination. We filed Freedom of Information law requests with the New York Department of Transportation to check the validity of the claims, but have not heard back at the close of production of this documentary. That Orleans' water is still drawing headlines 40 years later weighs heavy on me. It reminds me why I got into research in the first place, to help solve problems with the backing of data.
This was the investigative science that the postdoc at the open house had chatted to me about, but it involved using the scientific method, forming hypotheses, running experiments, applying concepts from chemistry, and it had a public and scientific value. Somewhere along the way, I think I got a little bit turned around due to societal pressures, but I can say with confidence that I'm still the same woman who was sitting in the conference room that day listening to the Love Canal tragedies. So far, graduate school has helped me affirm what I want to do with my life and has introduced me to so many amazing people from different walks of life who all care about environmental health. It has also helped me embrace my identity as a Latina in engineering, and I am so grateful for all the experiences I've had thus far. The next step for me is to become a college professor. As lame as it might sound, I find myself daydreaming about the kind of lab I'd like to run, the lessons I want my students to walk away with, and the kind of questions I'll be pursuing to help expand access to clean drinking water. I see myself working on the challenge of the depletion and contamination of fresh water and working with communities who are impacted by this. But I also want to take it a step farther and work on environmental policy and regulations to ensure that those who are most at risk are not forgotten and that decisions are made using the best science available. This year, I founded the Science Policy, Education, and Advocacy Coalition at Virginia Tech, and I'm working to get more scientists and engineers involved in shaping public policy and legislation. Regardless of the challenges and hurdles that come my way, I'm committed to spending my life and using my science to make this world a better place.